Rome had survived assassinations, rebellions, and the slow corrosion of civic virtue. But there were years when the empire seemed to tear at its own seams. The memory of 193, the year of the five emperors, still lingered like a scar beneath the marble. In that season of terror, the Praetorian Guard had auctioned the purple generals, had marched on Italy, and legitimacy had been decided by steel and bribery rather than law. A century later, Diocletian's great remedy, the Tetrarchy, had tried to cage that chaos with structure. Two senior emperors, two junior emperors, succession planned, like a military operation. The state held together by hierarchy and ritual, yet systems built to restrain ambition often teach men how to seize it. When Diocletian and Maximian abdicated, the carefully balanced machine shuddered. Oaths were broken, titles disputed, and the imperial map fractured into competing courts. Armies on distant frontiers proclaimed their own Augusti. Cities weighed their loyalties like wagers. In Rome itself, the old capital, long deprived of real power, still possessed something no provincial headquarters could manufacture: symbolic gravity. The Senate, the monuments, the streets that had watched triumphal processions for centuries, all of it, could anoint a ruler in the eyes of the populace, even if the legions were far away. Into that magnetic center stepped Maxentius. In 306, he seized Rome under the banner of restoring its dignity, exploiting resentment against imperial taxation and the perceived neglect of Italy. To his supporters, he was a defender of the ancient heart. To his enemies, he was a usurper who held the city hostage. He tightened his grip with the instruments Rome knew too well: control of the grain supply, manipulation of the guard, lavish games to purchase devotion, and punishments to silence dissent. The Tetrarchy had been designed to prevent exactly this: a hereditary prince turning Rome into a private kingdom. But now it faced its most dangerous contradiction: a ruler who was strongest where imperial order was weakest. North of the Alps, another man watched the unraveling with a soldier's patience. Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, had been raised within the imperial system and trained in its violence. When his father died at York in 306, the army proclaimed Constantine emperor. In the years that followed, he navigated the collapsing tetrarchic world with calculated restraint, accepting titles when useful, deferring when necessary, waiting for the moment when hesitation would be more dangerous than war. He consolidated Gaul and Britain, strengthened the Rhine frontier, and forged a reputation as a commander who rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. Maxentius and Constantine were not merely rivals for territory. They were competing answers to a single question: who had the right to rule the Roman world when old rules no longer held? Maxentius claimed Rome, Constantine claimed order. Each man understood that the empire was exhausted by civil war and hungry for certainty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered not only for its bloodshed, but for the story that would be told about why one man won and the other fell. And as Constantine's columns began to roll toward Italy, the conflict would take on the tone of fate, as if the heavens themselves were preparing to declare a verdict. By the autumn of 312, the campaign had become a swift, brutal procession through northern Italy. Constantine crossed the Alps with a force smaller than his enemies, yet his movements were decisive, his battles sharp and unsettling. Towns opened their gates, fortresses surrendered, Maxentius commanders were beaten in the field. The speed of the advance carried a message as powerful as any proclamation. This was not a hesitant contender bargaining for recognition, but a conqueror announcing a new order. As the armies drew near Rome, a different kind of tension settled over Constantine's camp, one that could not be measured in numbers of cavalry or sacks of grain. The sources that survive, written in later years when Constantine's victory had already begun reshaping the empire, speak of a moment poised between history and legend. Lactantius, a Christian writer close to Constantine's circle, describes a dream in which the emperor was instructed to mark the shields of his soldiers with a heavenly sign. Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, writing later and claiming to have heard the story from Constantine himself, offers something more dramatic. A vision in daylight, above the sun, a sign of the cross and words promising victory by this conquer. The ancient world was not a place where divine favor was an abstraction. Emperors had always wrapped themselves in sacred language. Victories were attributed to Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, the protective genius of Rome. Constantine himself had long trafficked in solar imagery. His coinage and public iconography had honored Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. The question that later centuries would press whether Constantine experienced a literal miracle or shaped a providential narrative after the fact cannot be answered with certainty. The evidence is layered and the accounts evolve in the telling. Some historians see political calculation, a man reading the currents of a changing empire. Others find the patterns of genuine religious experience, a mind seized by conviction on the brink of battle. What is beyond dispute is the power of the symbol that emerged from this story. The Chi Rho, two Greek letters, via and etia, and ati. The opening of the name Christ was unlike the eagles and thunderbolts of Rome's martial tradition. It carried a message that was both intimate and revolutionary. Victory tied not to an old civic pantheon, but to a god who had once been worshipped in secret, in catacombs and crowded apartments, by people accustomed to persecution. When a commander places a new standard before his men, he does more than decorate a battlefield. He changes the grammar of courage. Soldiers who believed that the gods had chosen their leader fought with the ferocity of the chosen. So the army marched south with something new among its familiar standards, an emblem that promised not merely conquest but divine sanction of a different kind. Ahead lay Rome, the prize that could crown Maxentius or annihilate him. Between them ran the Tiber River, and across it a bridge that would become a hinge in the story of the West. The battlefield was not an open plain chosen by impartial strategists. It was a choke point near the Milvian Bridge north of Rome, where roads narrowed, water hemmed in movement, and panic could multiply with every step. Maxentius had advantages that should have discouraged any attacker. He held the capital, had access to supplies, and could draw on forces that, at least on paper, outnumbered Constantine's. He could have waited behind Rome's formidable walls and forced a siege, starving an invading army, and letting disease do what swords could not. Yet he did not. Why Maxentius chose to fight outside the city has been debated for centuries. Ancient writers, hostile to him, painted it as hubris or superstition, an emperor lured into the open by prophecy and pride. Another interpretation is more practical and more chilling. The politics of Rome made delay dangerous. A siege would have tested the patience of the populace, threatened the grain supply, invited unrest, and exposed the fragility of Maxentius' hold over the city. He needed a decisive victory, a spectacle that would silence doubt and confirm him as the favored ruler of Rome. He marched out to meet Constantine, perhaps believing that the Tiber itself could be turned into an ally. A temporary bridge, likely of pontoons, was constructed, an expedient solution that may have been intended to control movement across the river. In theory, it offered flexibility. The army could deploy, retreat, and if necessary, deny Constantine passage. In practice, it created a deadly funnel in battle. What looks like a plan can become a trap the moment the unexpected happens. Constantine approached with the ruthless clarity of a commander who understood momentum. His smaller force could not afford hesitation. The engagement unfolded with the noise and confusion that no polished marble relief can capture. The drumbeat of feet, the metallic scream of impact, dust swallowing the horizon. Constantine's troops pressed hard, driving Maxentius's men back toward the river. Whether through superior positioning, discipline, or the psychological edge of recent victories, the tide began to turn. Then the geometry of disaster took over. An army pushed toward water does not retreat, it collapses. Men collide with their own comrades, formations disintegrate, and the instinct to survive becomes contagious panic. The Milvian Bridge and the temporary crossing behind it became bottlenecks choking with bodies in terror. Some were forced into the Tiber, armor dragging them down. Others fought to claw their way over the narrow passage only to be crushed by the weight of the retreat. Maxentius himself, the emperor who had claimed Rome, was swept into the catastrophe. Ancient accounts agree on the outcome, even when they disagree on the details. He fell into the river and drowned. His body was later recovered, and in a grim act heavy with symbolism, his severed head was carried into Rome. The city that had raised him now received the proof of his extinction. The battle ended not merely with a victory, but with a verdict. Constantine entered Rome not as a negotiator, but as a ruler confirmed by force, and in the story that followed, confirmed by heaven. Yet the most profound consequences were only beginning to unfold, because triumph on a bridge would soon become something larger, a transformation of the empire's religious and political soul. In the immediate aftermath, Constantine moved with the precision of a man who understood that wars are won twice, once on the battlefield and again in the realm of memory. Rome received him with ceremonies that blended relief, awe, and calculation. He dissolved institutions that had served Maxentius, including the Praetorian Guard, the old kingmakers who had for too long sold their allegiance. He presented himself as a liberator restoring lawful rule. Yet the nature of law in a shattered imperial system was malleable. What mattered was that Constantine had the power to define legitimacy. It is here, in the years after the Milvian Bridge, that the religious dimension of Constantine's reign becomes unmistakable. If the vision story was the spark, policy became the fire. In 313, Constantine and Licinius issued what is commonly known as the Edict of Milan, proclaiming religious tolerance and ordering the restoration of confiscated Christian property. The document did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire, nor did it outlaw the old cults. Its language was expansive, offering freedom of worship so that whatever divinity existed might grant favor to the rulers and the state. It was at one level a political act, unity through tolerance, stability through the removal of religious grievance, yet it also signaled something new, an imperial willingness to treat Christianity not as a threat to be contained, but as a force to be incorporated. Constantine's personal journey, however, did not proceed in a simple straight line from pagan to Christian. The early 4th century was a world of blended religious loyalties. Solar worship, traditional Roman rites, local deities, and philosophical monotheism overlapped in the imaginations of soldiers and senators alike. Constantine's own imagery reflects this complexity. For years after his victory, Sol Invictus still appeared in imperial contexts. He spoke in a vocabulary that could be understood across religious boundaries. Providence, the supreme deity, the favor of heaven. It is possible to see this as deliberate ambiguity, a ruler governing a diverse empire without shattering it. It is also possible to see it as genuine transition, the slow reorientation of a mind formed in one world and turning toward another. What did change, steadily and unmistakably, was the material reality of Christianity's place in the empire. Imperial patronage flowed into Christian communities, bishops gained access to the court, churches rose where secrecy had once been necessary. The faith that had endured under threat now learned to live with imperial favor, and favor always carries its own dangers: proximity to power, competition for influence, disputes sharpened by the knowledge that the emperor might decide the outcome. Those disputes came to a head in a controversy that threatened to fracture the very religion Constantine was elevating in Alexandria and beyond. Arguments raged over the nature of Christ. Was the Son co eternal with the Father, or a created being exalted above all others? The debate was not merely academic. In a world where theology shaped identity and community, doctrinal division could become civil unrest. Constantine, seeking unity, intervened not as a theologian but as an emperor who understood that a divided church could become a divided empire. In 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea. Bishops traveled across provinces to gather under imperial authority, a spectacle unimaginable in the days when Christians met under the shadow of arrest. The council produced a creed affirming that the Son was of one substance with the Father, a formulation designed to close the door on interpretations associated with Arius. The outcome did not end conflict. Controversy would continue for decades, but it established a precedent with staggering implications. The emperor as arbiter and patron of Christian orthodoxy. From the Milvian Bridge to Milan to Nicaea, the arc becomes clear. Constantine did not merely permit Christianity, he bound it to imperial power, and once that bond was forged, it would reshape both the church and the state, changing the meaning of victory, law, and divine favor for centuries to come. The Milvian Bridge has often been described as the moment paganism died and Christendom was born, yet history rarely obeys such clean endings. What happened on that riverbank in 312 was not the instantaneous replacement of one religion with another, but a decisive shift in imperial weather. Winds that had long been changing suddenly became a storm that could not be ignored. Constantine's victory cast a long shadow across Western civilization because it redefined what it meant to rule. Before him, emperors had claimed divine support. After him, an emperor could claim the backing of the Christian God. And that claim carried a different kind of authority. It was not tied to a city's ancient rites or to the reciprocal bargains of sacrifice and omen. It spoke in the language of universal truth, of a deity not limited by borders or temples. Imperial legitimacy began to merge with a faith that insisted on one God over all, one moral order, one ultimate judge. This blending of church and state did not simply elevate bishops, it altered the nature of political power. Christian leaders gained public standing, legal privileges, and the ability to shape policy. In turn, emperors found in Christian symbolism and organization tools for unity. The cross could become a banner not only of personal belief, but of public order. Yet this partnership carried tension at its core. A religion founded on martyrdom and moral witness now navigated court politics. A state built on conquest now spoke the language of salvation. The relationship would generate new forms of solidarity, but also new conflicts over doctrine, over authority, over the boundary between spiritual and temporal power. Paganism, meanwhile, did not vanish in a single generation. Temples still stood, sacrifices still smoked, old gods still had devotees in the Senate, in the countryside, and within the army. Even Constantine, despite his patronage of Christianity, did not launch a wholesale campaign to eradicate traditional cults. The transformation was gradual, marked by favor and neglect as much as by prohibition. Resources and prestige flowed increasingly toward Christian institutions, while older practices slowly lost their privileged position. In time, under later emperors, restrictions on sacrifice and public pagan rites grew harsher, and the balance tipped further. But the Milvian Bridge should be understood as a turning point, a moment when the direction of imperial destiny changed, rather than as a clean severing of the past. The deeper legacy lies in the story the empire told about itself afterward. In that story, Constantine's victory was not merely strategic brilliance or political fortune. It was providence. It was a sign that the world's greatest power could be enlisted in the service of a new faith. Once such a narrative takes root, it changes what people expect from rulers and what rulers dare to claim. And as the centuries unfolded, the echo of that narrative would roll far beyond Rome, shaping kingdoms, laws, wars, and consciences. Yet even the most triumphant stories contain within them a haunting question: what is gained and what is lost, when a faith of the persecuted becomes the faith of the powerful? The answer begins where the legend began, on the eve of battle beneath a sky heavy with omens. The river still ran as it always had, indifferent to banners and doctrines. The bridge still spanned the water, a practical structure turned into a monument by memory. Men had fought and drowned there, as men had fought and drowned, in countless forgotten clashes, yet this battle endured because it was woven into an explanation of the world. In the story of the Milvian Bridge, victory became proof of divine favor, and divine favor became a foundation for political order. The empire that emerged from Constantine's triumph was not instantly transformed into a realm of saints, nor was its violence washed away by a sacred sign. It remained an empire, vast, ambitious, often brutal, but its imagination had shifted. The symbols of authority began to change. The language of legitimacy began to change. The horizon of belief began to change. In that change lay both hope and peril, because when heaven is invoked to sanctify power, power learns to speak with the voice of heaven. Maxentius had tried to anchor himself in Rome's ancient prestige, in the weight of tradition and the theater of the old capital. Constantine anchored himself in something more expansive, a claim that the ruler's fate was tied to a universal God, whether born from vision, calculation, or a fusion of both. That claim proved stronger than walls, stronger than the guard, stronger than the old gods' familiar names. It did not end paganism in a day, but it began the long rearrangement of the world's spiritual and political architecture. Empires often fall in silence, their ends marked by empty treasuries and abandoned frontiers. This one did not fall, it turned, and on the Milvian Bridge, amid the crush of bodies and the cold pull of the Tiber, the Roman Empire stepped onto a road that would lead it away from the altars of its ancestors and toward a new kind of eternity. In the end, the most enduring conquerors are not those who seize a city, but those who seize the story by which history remembers the conquest.